Greetings everyone, my name is Rejnols, and today we're taking a look at how GW is currently balancing 40k, as well as how often they might want to balance 40k. We're also going to be talking about a few different things they could be doing, and at the end I'm just going to give my personal opinion. I think this is a good discussion to have because Warhammer 40k is a game that is constantly unbalanced, both in a good way and a bad way. So I think it's just a decent discussion to have, and I think it could be very beneficial to just get a lot of voices in here and give different opinions. Now, I'm not going to be talking about how they balance the game, as in over-nerfing and all those things. We're more talking about like how often should they be looking at the game, updating things, all that stuff. So first of all, let's look how they update the game in 10th edition. Now, in September, we had both a balanced data slate as well as a points update. However, GW have been saying in MetaWatch videos that they would like to update the game with points updates first and foremost and rules updates after. Now, they haven't said that they wouldn't do both if need be, which is what we saw in September, but from what I'm getting from what they're saying is that if possible, they would like to update the game every 3 months by adjusting points and update the game every 6 months by adjusting rules. Which is the opposite way that what they were doing it in 9th edition. In 9th edition, they were updating rules every 3 months and points every 6 months. Now, the reason why they've made this change is pretty much very simple. They didn't want to change up the rules of units, armies, all the time, because that is slightly frustrating and can be annoying as well as very hard to balance. And you might be like, every 3 months? That's like 4 times a year. How can that be dramatic? Well, I mean, you gotta remember that you watching this video is in the minority, right? We are the guys and girls who play the game a lot. Some people play 1 game a month. Some people play the game without even looking at these updates more than, once a year or every 6 months, or doesn't even pay attention to when they come out and only realize the rules have been updated when someone else tells them. So if you do update the grand rules of an army every 3 months, then all of a sudden they're like, I don't know what faction I'm playing anymore. When I started playing, I was doing this, but now that just doesn't work anymore. There's also just having to constantly figure out like what the enemy army can do. Like 1 month, they do this thing, and then the next month, this is completely different. So in honesty, I think it's a fine way to look at things, being like, we want to mostly touch points and then afterwards look at rules. I think that's totally fair. That being said, again, they have shown that they're willing to update both points and rules if need be. And yes, as I've written here, the last data slate was a good example of that, because if they were following the way they were doing things in 9th edition, this should have just been a points update. But instead, it was a rules update as well as a points update. So, that's good. Now, there is one thing I want to compare 40k to, and that is video games. Now, there's a lot of video games out there that gets a lot of updates. The one I'm taking precedence from is League of Legends. If you don't know League of Legends, it's a MOBA game, which means Massive Online Battle Arena. Is that what MOBA means? I've forgotten. I've gotten old. In any case, it's a game where you're 5 against 5, you each control a champion, you play a game. That's really all you need to know. My point is not that. My point is that League of Legends gets an update every 2 weeks. Now, these updates are usually on the smaller side of things. So it would be individual champions that get some numbers adjusted or some items get nerfed and buffed. And then, every so often there will be a bigger update. They still happen every 2 weeks, but maybe it is 1 update in 4 updates. So every 8 weeks, we'll have a bigger update, as in a new item is added, or a champion is reworked, or whatever the case may be. So while it is getting updated very often, it's very small updates, on a grand scheme anyway. They are also fairly good at hotfixing things. A hotfix is simply an update that wasn't planned. We've actually, for the first time probably ever in Warhammer's history, seen a hotfix when Deathwatch Index came out. When the Deathwatch Index came out, people immediately found out that you could deal like insane a number of devastating wounds by using a stratagem in combination with certain units in the Deathwatch Codex or Index. And I think it was only 1 or 2 days after that, GW posted an update being like, oh yeah, by the way, we didn't notice that one, and obviously that's not how we intended for that to work, so we're changing it. But updates every 2 weeks in League of Legends keeps things changing, it keeps things from being too good for too long, and it's a very good system. Again, we're not going to be talking about how they balance things, or if they overdo it or underdo it. I'm just saying League of Legends updates every 2 weeks means that the game stays fresh fairly often. Now, if we're asking GW to update Warhammer every 2 weeks, that might be a bit too much. So first of all, unlike League of Legends, Warhammer is a physical game. Riot Games, the creators of League of Legends, can collect data much faster and much more efficiently because the game is online. First of all, that means that the data can be read, as it happens. But it also means that there's just more players. Even if League of Legends and Warhammer had the same amount of people playing it, there would still be an not infinitely, but a way higher amount of League of Legends games than Warhammer games, because the Warhammer games, first of all, take a lot longer. You also need to go to a physical location, set up the game, yada yada yada. Whereas League of Legends, you boot up your computer, you launch the game, and there you go. What I was trying to say with all of that is that collecting data is a big part of updating a game, and the data being collected for Warhammer takes a bit longer than 2 weeks to collect for a decent amount anyway. Another thing that makes it a bit easier for Riot Games to balance League of Legends compared to Games Workshop and Warhammer is that League of Legends is kind of tiered. Now what I mean by that is that in League of Legends, when you play ranked, which would be playing competitive in Warhammer, you're assigned a rank, and that rank reflects your skill level. So if, for example, a champion, one of the characters you control in League of Legends, is performing really well at a high level of play, Riot can look at the data and see how the champion is performing at what points in the game, and then adjust the champion to a point where they are slightly less effective at the higher tier of play without necessarily affecting lower tiers of play. Having this rank system also means that a completely new player doesn't necessarily have to play against a very good player or experienced player. In Warhammer tournaments, that's of course not the case. The first game is usually completely randomized. You could be playing your 10th game of Warhammer and you go up against a guy from Art of War. That's just how that is. That also makes it a lot easier for Riot Games to balance League of Legends, because they can look at, okay, this champion is doing really good in high-level games, but not that great in low-level games. So we should probably look to buff nerf that champion in this way. Whereas if something is really good at the top end of Warhammer, it's probably also pretty good at the low end of Warhammer. But the top end player obviously knows how to use that unit more efficiently, and the low end player doesn't really. I think I went on a bit of a tangent there. What I am trying to say is that it is much easier to see if something is overpowered at a high level of play in League of Legends than it is in Warhammer. It is also very hard for GW to nerf something so it only affects the high end of Warhammer and not the low end of Warhammer. Because obviously you cannot, say that this unit gets worse the longer into a tournament you get. I hope you're catching my drift. I'm just saying that League gets updated every 2 weeks, and the amount of knobs they can adjust means that they can easily balance the game for the top end versus the low end, which is a lot harder for Warhammer. So I tried to sit down and figure out what is reasonable when you look at League of Legends compared to Warhammer to try and find a middle ground, so to speak. Now, I am of the personal opinion that I would like to see more updates to Warhammer. I don't think it's a bad thing to have updates every 3 months, but I think we can do better. So first of all, before we look at how often they maybe should update the game, let's talk about this whole data collection part. As mentioned, Warhammer is a physical game, it takes time, and therefore data collection is slow. Let's pretend that GW were to update the game every 2 weeks. Now, on a big weekend of 40k, I would say there's anywhere between 8 or 10 events of grand tournament scale, which is basically 24 plus players, 26 plus players. It's like 20 plus players, and then at that point it's considered a grand tournament, and that's, I think, what most people use in their data collection. In any case, let's go with 2 weeks and an average of 15 events taking place over those 2 weeks. Each of those events have 50 players in them, because some events will have 150 players and some will have 40, so an average of 50 players is just what we're gonna go with. That would be a total of 750 games, excluding any shadow rounds or tiebreakers or whatever not. And 750 games over 2 weeks, it's not a whole lot. You might think it's a whole lot, but then you also remember that there are 30-something factions in the game, 28-something factions in the game. And you start saying, okay, how many games will there be played for each of those factions? And then you end up being like, oh, that's only going to be like 40-ish something games per faction, which is, if everyone played every faction equally, that is. And at that point, it's like, that's just not enough data to calculate anything on. As I mentioned at the start of the video, there's also those that don't like the constant updates. There are those that are playing an army and don't follow whenever an update comes out and just gets confused whenever rules gets changed. And yeah, as I mentioned, you are a minority. The person watching this video, you are a minority. You are one of those that care a lot about Warhammer and play a lot of Warhammer, even if that's only 2 games a week. That probably still puts you in the top 10% of people who play Warhammer. And then there's also the factor that Warhammer 40k is already a very, very complex game. If you've ever helped a new player get into the game, you probably know how much of a hassle it actually is to get them to understand their rules, remember their rules, know the interactions, and updating not only how the core game works, but how every army works every 2 weeks could be completely catastrophic because 1 week you know your unit does this thing and then the next week they do something completely different, or this interaction actually works different than it did last week. It will just get very confusing very, very quickly. So let's try and find a compromise. And here is what I think would be very cool, and that would be a monthly update focused on small changes. When I say small changes, I mean small changes. It would be nothing as big as changing devastating wounds the way they did in the data balance slate. Balanced data slate, not the data balanced, whatever, you know what I mean. That is what I would consider a big change. That is a core part of the game that is changed. I am completely fine with those kind of things only happening every 3 months. However, I think there are a lot of small issues in the game that could very, very much benefit from having monthly updates to answer them. These could be things such as points, missing keywords, or confusing rules. All of these things can be answered fairly easily within a month with the data collection, and I don't think it would be unfair to ask GW to do those things. Now, the big changes in these small changes would be something like this. So imagine the update it's the end of the month or the start of the month, and an update comes out, and GW makes their new monthly data balance, and they go like this. Drukhari are not performing very well, so we're gonna allow Archons to join Incubi. That is a fairly big change for Drukhari, but it's not such a big change that it'll completely change how interactions between armies work. It's a big change because, a completely new unit suddenly exists, which is Incubi being joined by Archons. That is something Drukhari currently cannot do. And after a month of data collection, GW would be looking at the data and be like, okay, yeah, Drukhari are still not performing. What can we do? This is a fairly big change, but let's give it a go. And hey, let's say it turns out that Archons joining Incubi just completely makes Drukhari busted. Next update, they can be like, alright, Archons can still join Incubi, but now they cost X amount more, or they lose this keyword, or ability changes to this. So that is the level, that's the biggest change I would include in these monthly updates. And then examples of the small changes I would like to see would be something like this. Chaos Space Marines are doing quite well, and we have noticed Obliterators being in almost every list during our data collection, so we're increasing the price per model by 10. This is a nerf that can be given 1 month and be taken away another month. If they suddenly find out that Chaos Space Marines just completely fall together without their use of Obliterators, they can just be like, alright, that changed last month, we're taking it back, and we're gonna revisit them in 3 months when we're doing our big data slate. This will help keep the game a bit more healthy because while the game is more healthy now than it has been at the start of the edition, we still see a lot of small things that are just like stupid or broken or just not working at all. And these small updates could help pretty much fix those, and I don't really think they take that much work. This is all, of course, assuming that GW has a well-structured design and data gathering team, which I think they do, I just don't think they use them optimally. Or rather, I don't think they do. So again, just to summarize, monthly updates, what could they do? Well, for example, it's been a big question for a lot of people if ignore modifiers also works on -1 damage and -1 AP like Armor of Contempt. That could be clarified in a month. And let's say that they say, alright, you know what? Yes, it does ignore -1 damage and -1 AP. Then during the next month's data collection, they notice that a lot more people take those units and they actually make the win rate of those armies increase by a lot. They can then go, you know what, we did say that last month, but we're taking it back. It does not work against -1 damage and -1 AP. And then that's that, you know? It's a rule change, it's a clarification, because some people play with it, some people don't play with it. It would be nice to get, a monthly update on these sort of rules where people are like, it can be either or. You also have a case of missing keywords. For Custodes in particular, Valyrian does not have the Deep Strike keyword, despite every single other infantry character in Custodes having Deep Strike. Is that supposed to be a thing? We don't know. Some people say it's a mistake, some people say it's not. Then we have the big changes, such as an army's underperforming. What can we do to try and adjust that without having to rework the entire faction, or at least give a big look at the entire faction? Let's try and let this character join this unit and see if that changes things. And then the small changes. These armies are overperforming. What is the most popular units? Let's go ahead and give them a small points increase and see how that changes things. I don't think those things combined is going to wreak havoc across the metagame. They're not going to fix the entire thing, but it's going to help. And that, in short, is why I would like to see monthly updates for GW. And then I still want the 3-month and 6-month updates. Let those be the big changes. And then, use these monthly updates to keep track of what's working, what's not working, and take it from there. In any case, that is simply my opinion. I would love to hear what you have to say in the comments. You're also very welcome to join the Discord, where we discuss mostly Custodes, but Warhammer 40k in general. And finally, if you'd like to see more content, mostly focused on Custodes, but in general, Warhammer 40k, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Alright, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you again, I hope you have a wonderful time.